I know over the years, we've had the chance to talk to you about the trip that I took to Egypt when I was in seminary. And that trip, among some other trips that I had taken when I was in seminary, was really transformative for me in learning more about the world and my faith. And I wanted to share a story from that experience while I was in Egypt, when myself and the rest of the seminary students that we went to Egypt with, and our professor, we went to go have dinner with the Coptic bishop in Egypt, which is the Coptic church is the Christian church in Egypt, and so the bishop is sort of like the equivalent to the Pope for the Coptic church. And he invited us to come to dinner with him and get a chance to talk with him a little bit. And we sat down for this meal, and there were a couple rules that we had learned while we were there. The first thing was, of course, the bishop sat at the head of the table. And then on the right side of the bishop is where our professor, he sat. And then because I was the only other man in the group, I had to sit next to the professor. And since Stina and I were the only couple in the group, Stina got to sit next to me. And then the rest of the women in the group, they got to sit wherever they wanted. And we sat down, and we started talking to each other, and all of a sudden the kitchen door opens up, and all of these maids come out with our food. And they bring out plates of food, and they put them down and make sure that we have everything that we need. And we start, we wait until, of course, everybody has their food. And I watched my professor, and my professor wasn't eating. And so I figured, well, if he's not eating, I'm not going to start eating. It turned out that my professor was the honored guest at this table. And so once he picked up his fork to be able to eat, then that meant that everybody else could start eating. And so he started eating, and then we all started eating after that. Well, like every good American, I've been taught as a kid growing up that whatever food you get put in front of you, you need to eat all of it on your plate, right? We've all grown up with this idea. This is very much a cultural kind of experience that we have here in the United States. Well, in Egypt, culturally, it's disrespectful to eat all of the food on your plate. Isn't that something? It shows them, it basically communicates to those folks that they didn't give you enough food. So, like a good American, I've sat and I ate all of my food, right? And the ladies who were standing up against the wall were watching us eat, and they saw that I had finished my food, and as soon as I finished my food, they took my plate, went in the back, and came out with a fresh plate of food. And I thought to myself, okay, all right, I can do this. Started eating a little bit more. I finished the second plate of food. They come and get my plate. They walk back into the kitchen. They come out again with a third plate of food. And I'm thinking to myself, oh boy, this is brutal, right? A couple deep breaths, stretch break, start digging into it. And I get out halfway through the plate, and my face must have turned like a different shade of color or something, because my professor leans over next to me, and him and the bishop were having conversations in a language I did not understand, and they were giggling and laughing and pointing at me, and so suddenly my professor leans over and he says to me, he goes, "Gary, don't finish the food on your plate." It's like, what? And he goes, "If you leave food, they won't bring you more." It's like, oh, okay. And I realized, this meal for me was this lesson in how we all have different cultural understandings around food, right? Even within our own homes. I'm sure you've experienced when you've gone to eat somewhere at someone else's house, right? That there's different sort of cultural norms around what you do and how you eat and all of that kind of stuff. And as Steve and I got married, we found out that like our family did things one way, her family did things a different way, and that our family was going to do something that was unique to us. But there was also not only a lesson, I think, about the culture around food and around eating a meal, but then there was also a lesson I learned about power and power structures around a meal. This idea that that as an honored guest, as a religious leader, that this Coptic bishop had maids, and it was their sole purpose to provide a meal for us and to make sure that we had enough food, and that they stood there for the 2 hours and 2.5 hours or so that we had this meal and talked. They stood and waited and watched us eat to make sure that we had absolutely everything that we needed. That there were specific places that people of power were allowed to sit. And in that culture, as a man, I had certain privileges that the women in our group did not have. And as the professor of the seminary, he had even more privileges than I did. And if you think about it, there is this reality of when we gather together for food, who we have our meal with, where we eat, how much we eat, when we eat, all of those things say a lot about who we are as people. And I was reading an article about this called The Lost Art of Eating by Ingrid Rowland, who's a historian who has tracked the idea or the sort of social construct around eating meals together. And what she talks about is that throughout history, throughout all of history, that the concept of having a meal together more often than not, was a metaphor or taught us lessons about power and about culture. That all of them, and how we eat and who we eat with, all these things suggest something about our identity, our community, and our social status. And that's exactly what's at the heart of our gospel lesson for today. We're going to take a look at Luke chapter 14, where Jesus sits down to have a meal with one of the more prominent Pharisees of his time. But before we dig into the text itself, I want to give us a little bit of background about food in the Bible and having meals together. Because food is everywhere in the Bible. Of course, we know about the Passover meal and about the Jews who, as a result of the angel passing over, right, had been able to escape from Egypt, and then how the Jewish tradition celebrated the holiday of Passover, this idea of freedom from slavery. In the 613 commandments of the mitzvah, of the divine commandments of the Jewish faith, about 70 of them pertain to food and cooking and having meals together. Jesus' first miracle in the Bible is when he takes water and turns it into wine at a wedding. You remember that story? And of course, we've got the story of the Last Supper, the feeding of the 5,000, and then throughout all of the New Testament, stories about feeding the hungry. There are debates around eating with dirty utensils and the impact that it has on our relationship with God, which foods are ritually clean and unclean and able for us to eat, and how we should make them clean if they're unclean. There are rules around fasting and farming. All of these kinds of things are in the Bible. Now, Jesus himself, there's lots of things that happen with Jesus around food. And Jesus, more often than not, eats food with people who are marginalized, who are poor. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because as a person of status, as a religious leader and as a rabbi, Jesus would not or should not have been seen eating with the poor, because the poor were considered dirty and unworthy. And so you'll see in the New Testament that people criticize Jesus. They actually call him a drunken and a glutton because he's eating with people who are deemed unworthy to eat with. But here's what's interesting about Jesus. He not only eats with the poor and the marginalized, he also, as a person of status, eats with people who are also in places of status. Like in the story that we're about to read in Luke chapter 14, where Jesus sits down with a Pharisee, a prominent Pharisee, to have a meal with him. And he decides to share a parable with this group of people while he's there. And what's interesting is that Jesus is considered a guest of honor as someone who's prominent. And people would have fought with each other to be in that place of prominence. So it sort of sets the stage for this text. Jesus is invited to be with this Pharisee in this meal on the Sabbath day as a guest of honor, along with other people who would be deemed guests of honor. And they're trying to figure out who's going to get the chance to sit in the special places. And who are the people who are going to have to sit further away from the person who's hosting the meal. And this is what Jesus has to say. Starting in Luke chapter 14, verse 1, and then we jump from verse 1 to verse 7 through verses 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor, in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, give this person your place. And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Boy, Jesus sounds like a really great house guest, doesn't he? Anybody want to invite him over for dinner so he can tell you all the things you're doing wrong and all of the guests around you? That's what he does, right? I mean, think about this for a second. Have any of you had the experience of sitting somewhere and being asked to move because you weren't in the right spot? Anybody have that experience before? Doesn't feel very good, does it? No matter how polite a person could be, to find out that you're in their spot, that you did a little social faux pas, that you sat down in a place where you weren't supposed to sit down, is not a good feeling. Or maybe you had an experience like me, where suddenly you were in this group of people and you realized these dynamics of power and culture within a meal. And that they were so prevalent that you realized that you fell further down in the pecking order maybe you would have thought, or didn't know as much as what you thought you needed to know in order to be a part of the meal. In our text for today, Jesus is acknowledging the reality of power. Not only the reality of power, but also of identity and community within the context of sitting down for a meal together. And I would argue that this doesn't just apply to meals, but it also applies to so many different aspects of our lives. At this one story, in this one parable that Jesus gives about a meal, is just a microcosm for our whole lives. And the expectation for how we should be in relationship with one another. Recognizing that these dynamics of power and identity are so prevalent within our cultures. And Jesus gives some clear instructions to all of us. In verse 11, where he says, first, For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. To recognize that in our relationships with one another, we are called to humble ourselves. To not assume our own status or feeling of importance. To recognize that we may not know things, that there may be somebody there that's more important than we are, that needs to be welcomed, that needs to be encouraged. And then I think the second thing that Jesus is telling us is to be aware of that dynamic. To recognize the power struggles that happen in our relationships, not just at meals, but wherever it is that we are, our work life, our family, what we happen to do for fun, in our relationships with other people, to be aware of those power dynamics that exist. And how in those power dynamics that there can be people who feel excluded because of those dynamics. And how we are called as individuals to acknowledge those power dynamics and to figure out ways to make sure that people feel welcomed and encouraging. Which gets to the third point, to be welcoming of everyone. To not just be in relationship with people that are just like us or believe the same things that we believe, but to surround ourselves with people who are different from us. To invite ourselves into relationship with people that we wouldn't normally invite ourselves into relationship with. There are a few examples that I have that I think particularly as a community, as the Milton Lutheran Church, in our identity as the Milton Lutheran Church, I think we do a really good job of embracing this idea of being humble, being aware, and being welcoming of everyone within the context of meals. The first I want to talk about is the self-care sanctuary. We've been doing the self-care sanctuary for a few years now, and we know, those who are newer to our community may not know, we provide hygiene and self-care products for people in need, free of charge. And in addition to that, we also provide a meal. And I know that over the years, as the need has grown and the cost of all of the products has grown, that the group of people who provide leadership for the self-care sanctuary have talked a lot about whether or not we need to provide a meal. And maybe we shouldn't worry about a meal and we should just focus on the hygiene products. But you see, this text, I think, is a reminder for us for just how important that meal is. Because it's not just about us as a community providing hygiene care products for people in need. It's about being in relationship with people in our community. And that meal is the setting for that. The meal is that opportunity for us to sit down and be in relationship with people in our community that we wouldn't normally get the chance to be in relationship with. This is exactly what Jesus is calling us to do. This is exactly what the parable is about. Some of you will know that we have a partnership with the Getting Ahead Foundation. The Getting Ahead Foundation provides support for people who are in poverty. You can sign up to be a part of a 19-week program that will assist you as an individual to get out of poverty, to give you the tools to be able to get out of poverty. And one of the things that they do in that program is to provide a meal. And our church, over the years, has had the opportunity to support them, not only by providing space for them and financial resources and worship space and all of that, but also providing meals. And one of the rules of their director, Rose Williams, is that it's not just as simple as providing the meal, but you also provide the meal and then you sit down and eat with the people who are in the Getting Ahead program, and you have a meal together. It recognizes this power dynamic that happens when people of privilege provide a meal for people who do not have privilege. If you just provide the meal and don't talk to people and say here and assume that that's what they need, then it creates a power dynamic that frankly isn't healthy. That doesn't prioritize the relationship with people. And so Rose challenges us to sit down and eat with the people that we are providing the meal with. Just again, in the way that Jesus recommends. And then the third thing I want to talk about is something that we do every single Sunday with communion. There are churches all over the place that have all kinds of restrictions about communion. When you can commune, what you commune with, how you have to stand, whether you can kneel, all of these kind of rules and regulations and all of that kind of stuff that create a dynamic that limits people's access to the most important gift, the love and grace and forgiveness of Christ. And it's been wonderful to be a part of a church community that welcomes everybody to the table, no matter what, without any preconceived notions, without an age restriction, without having to attend a class or whatever. It recognizes that God's grace is for everybody, and it's our role to create an environment where that happens. These are just a few examples of, as a community, how we've embraced that sense of identity around a meal, of welcome, of humbleness, and awareness. You see, for me, when I look at this text, what Jesus is saying to all of us is that we are all honored guests. We are the ones who get to sit next to the host and to be treated special, to be set apart and loved by God. And we are challenged by God as the honored guest to extend that hospitality that Jesus has shown to us to one another. I wonder how different our relationships would look if we all treated each other like honored guests. What would happen in our relationships if we saw each and every single person as an honored guest, and we saw our purpose as making sure to extend the same hospitality that God extends to us to one another? Imagine the kind of love and how that love would transform our relationships and the world around us if we treated each other in the same way that God treats us. I think that God calls us into these kinds of relationships with one another, not just around a meal, but in every aspect of our lives, as humbled guests, loved by God, embraced by God, and honored by God. Amen.